With AAA's legendary roadside assistance and access to hotel, concert, and restaurant discounts, members can expect something more. As a member, AAA Roadside Assistance has your back if you're stranded on the side of the road. You're covered whether you're locked out of your car, have a dead battery, need a tow, or run out of gas. Plus, roadside assistance isn't just for your car. It's with you wherever you go, 24/7, 365. And this peace of mind can be yours for about $5 a month. Offers, terms, conditions, and policies are subject to change without notice. Visit AAA.com/member for details.
"37-year-old Jessy Kurchewski was arrested and charged with stealing from her friend, 63-year-old Lynn Hernan. She was also charged with her murder. Before and after trial, Jessy would also be accused of forging documents to try to get herself out of trouble. Documents that accused her victim of murder and her attorney of wrongdoing. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello, and welcome back. This is part 2 of a 2-part series, so if you haven't listened to part 1, I definitely recommend backing up and listening to that first. And if you're one of those who saved part 1 so you could listen to it back to back with part 2, I see you because I am you, and welcome back. I said that this episode was going to be shorter, but as you can tell by the runtime, I am a liar. I truncated as much as I could, and I left things out that I didn't think were too relevant to the overall case, but I ran out of things to cut. And in this case, because we spent pretty much part 1 talking about the evidence against Jessy Kurchewski, I didn't want to shortchange her defense. I wanted to give them a fair shake, so here we are, settle in. I'm just going to summarize the first episode very quickly for the people who listened right when it came out. Jessy Kurchewski got out of prison for fraud/identity theft in early 2016. She started helping out a lifelong friend who she viewed more like an aunt, Lynn Hernan, because Lynn was battling with health issues. Over the next 2.5 years, Lynn's health got worse and worse until Jessy found her dead on October 3rd, 2018. Though the death was initially suspected to be a drug overdose, whether intentional or accidental was to be determined, the autopsy showed that Lynn died of a tetrahydrozoline overdose, that is the active ingredient in redness-reducing eye drops. Jessy was questioned many times, and her story kept changing and shifting. First, Lynn wasn't suicidal, then she was, then Jessy actually caught her with a gun in her hand one day and had to take it off of her. And when it came out that Lynn was poisoned with eye drops, Jessy first said Lynn used a lot of drops in her eyes, then said she saw Lynn put some in her vodka sometimes, but not on the day of her death, to finally saying she handed Lynn a bottle of water that Lynn had put 6 bottles of Visine into. These changing stories, plus the evidence they had that Jessy had stolen nearly $300,000 from Lynn both before and after her death, that made Jessy the prime suspect in murder. She was arrested and charged in June of 2021, about 2.5 years after Lynn's death. The trial then took over 2 years to begin, in part due to Jessy's changing attorneys. I need to issue a correction from last episode. The last episode, I said that she had 4 different attorneys withdraw, and that was inaccurate. She had 3 attorneys withdraw, but one came back and withdrew again. I just should have taken better notes on that. The trial started in October of 2023, which was 5 years after Lynn Hernan's death. And Jessy had 2 very experienced attorneys representing her. Both of them had been practicing for around 30 years, and one of them had spent 27 of those years as a prosecutor. Prior to the trial beginning, Jessy disclosed that she had found some letters from Lynn while going through boxes about 2 or 3 months after her death. Jessy had not turned these letters over to the police before. And they were essentially suicide notes explaining things to various people in Lynn's life And there was also a new will in there that disinherited Anthony, who was the only other heir other than Jessy. We are going to get into these documents a little bit later because it doesn't look like these letters were fully admissible in the trial. There were some references that seemed to nod towards them, but it just makes more sense to cover the trial first before we get into these documents. So at trial, the state had to prove 3 things beyond a reasonable doubt: that Jessy murdered Lynn, that she stole her money before her death, and then she stole money from her estate after. The state argued to the jury that Lynn was a sick woman who depended on Jessy for care, and in return, Jessy took power of attorney, drained Lynn's accounts, ran up credit cards in her name, and as soon as Lynn was nearly out of money, she killed her so she could take the assets too, like the equity in Lynn's condo. They accused Jessy of killing Lynn with the eye drops and then staging the scene to look like a suicide by crushing up pills around her, putting some of the crushed pill dust in the corners of her mouth, and getting rid of the eye drop bottles. Then Jessy got to work building an alibi with her shopping receipts. Of course, she shopped using Lynn's money, which then goes towards proving the theft. The medical examiner was one of the first people the state put on the stand in order to establish the cause of death. The tetrahydrozoline was the only thing above therapeutic levels in her system, but the ME said that she had never before seen a case where this drug was the cause of death, which the defense used to question her authority in determining this if she had no experience with this particular drug. Of course, medical examiners have all sorts of first times over the course of their work, and they don't always happen while they're in school or training under someone else. Sometimes they do come across something new or novel to them, so they research and still make their determination. Saying they're not qualified to make a determination just because they've never made this determination before doesn't really fly with me as far as experts go. The state then laid out the financial records, one to prove the theft, but also the theft was the motive for the murder, so it's all intertwined here. The financial records did show the amount of money drained from Lynn's account and how it was not just the money, but also Lynn's credit score. In June of 2018, so a few months before her death, Lynn's credit score was in the low 800s. But we see at this point there's not enough money left to pay all those credit cards that had been racking up those balances or a $30,000 loan that had been taken out. So by the time of Lynn's death 4 months later, her credit score was only 600. Meanwhile, Jessy's finances seemed better than ever since becoming Lynn's power of attorney. Her on-the-books income from employment over 2 years was $50,000. Not per year, that's total for those 2 years. Jessy had long periods of unemployment, including one where she would get dressed every morning and pretend to go to work even though she didn't have a job. Her boyfriend's cousin testified that he was living with her and her boyfriend Scott in this time period, and Jessy had confessed to him that she was unemployed and pretending otherwise. He said he was surprised only because of Jessy's spending. She admitted to having been out of work for upwards of 6 months, but still seemed to have unlimited funds. The state had a few other people testify to money Jessy seemed to have from an invisible source. Her boyfriend's ex-wife testified that Jessy offered to pay for her to go to Thailand to visit her oldest daughter who was living there. And of course she didn't accept because, one, this was too much money to comfortably take from your ex-husband's new girlfriend, but also because she didn't know how Jessy could afford that. She thought she might be overextending herself with credit cards. The state also had Lynn's friends testify that they didn't know her to give anyone large amounts of money. And this would be important because obviously that's Jessy's best defense. She didn't take the money, Lynn gave it to her. So they had people testify that Lynn's gifts tended to be more modest. Anthony, who's the young man who Lynn viewed as a nephew, testified that one time she gave him a GameStop gift card of $100, and he was really surprised because that was so much more than she usually gave. If someone had a milestone like a high school graduation, maybe she'd put $200 in the card. But Lynn never gave high dollar amounts anywhere in the range that Jessy was claiming Lynn gave her. But the defense said she absolutely did, and Lynn also spent as much as anyone else would have if they had a large nest egg and they didn't believe they had long to live. They pointed out that Lynn was spending before Jessy came along. The money market account that comes up repeatedly in this case had $346,000 in it in June of 2014. And that's after Lynn bought her condo. When Jessy got out of prison, it had $271,000 in it. So in about 21 months, Lynn had spent out of that account $75,000. That averages out to about $3,500 a month, but I looked closely at the ledger the defense provided. It was a month-by-month balance sheet, and it's clear Lynn didn't take out the average every month. There would be some months where she took a large amount out and some where she took only a small amount. Prior to June of 2016, there were only a few really large drops in the account. And they happened pretty much that first year. One was for $16,000, there was another for $10,000, and these were not consecutive months. Overall, when I look at this, and we're talking about someone whose only other income was Social Security disability, it doesn't really look like Lynn was supplementing an ongoing overspending habit, but rather she pulled out more money as she needed it and less when she didn't. June of 2016 is when the account starts seeing big drops again. In that month, it dropped $10,000, then the next was $32,000, then the next was $16,000, then the next was another $16,000, and never before that point, June 2016, had Lynn spent that much in a 4-month period. And then it kept dropping until October of 2018 to where there was only $88 left. I do not see what the defense is presenting here. I don't see Lynn's spending habits pre-June of 2016 looking anything like they did after. Something definitely changed, and the state's argument was that Jessy was the change. But the defense said this was still Lynn calling all the shots. Just like with the $30,000 loan that was taken out in Lynn's name, but with Jessy's phone number and bank account. The defense conceded that there was fraud involved in that loan, but they said Lynn was in on it. Jessy helped Lynn apply for the loan, and the application falsely claimed and showed that Lynn had an income far higher than she actually had. The proof for this, for Lynn knowing about it, is circumstantial. When Jessy added Lynn to the account the loan had been deposited into, it had to be done in person. So there was someone at the bank who saw Lynn show up with Jessy and have her added to the account. It doesn't really definitively prove why Lynn thought she was being added to the account, but it does show that she was aware that something was happening. The defense also called an FBI forensic expert to the stand to testify that some of the checks the state claimed Jessy had written to herself appeared to have been written by Lynn. But there was some concession there that there were inconsistencies with some of the checks. This expert definitely got the defense closer to showing that Lynn gave Jessy large gifts. But the issue was that even if the jury accepted that Lynn signed some of those checks, it doesn't mean that they would believe she signed all of them. They just had to believe she signed enough to fit the threshold for a felony theft charge. The state then had another witness that they called to prove Jessy stole the money, and it is my least favorite type of witness, which we all know is a jailhouse informant. For those who are newer to my show, I do want to make it clear that I'm not discounting informants because they have criminal records. It's because they're incentivized. Even if they are promised nothing in exchange for their testimony, they certainly hope they're going to have some type of consideration, and that was definitely the case here. A woman named Magdalena was locked up with Jessy for a few months leading up to November of 2022. In January of 2023, she reached out to the detectives to offer to inform on things Jessy had told her. But her first question to them was that if she cooperated, would she get any type of deal? She hoped to avoid prison time on an OWI. And it looks like, according to the Wisconsin court records, that this was at least her 7th offense. Magdalena coming forward looks to be one of the reasons Jessy's attorney pre-trial withdrew. According, again, to the court records, he was also representing Magdalena in that OWI case. And the same month she spoke to the detectives, he withdrew from both cases due to a non-waivable conflict of interest. And it's pretty clear this would have been the conflict. The detectives told Magdalena that they could call the DA's office and let them know that she was helping out, but they could not make any promises. And at the time Magdalena testified, the case she had was still pending, and the DA at that point had not offered her any deals, which is what she testified to. That said, it doesn't mean she didn't still hope she would get some consideration, and maybe she even did. The case has since been resolved, and she pleaded guilty and got 3 years in prison, which is the minimum for the offense she pleaded out to. So, did she get consideration in her sentencing based on cooperating in this case? It's hard to say. We don't know. Anyway, Magdalena testified that Jessy talked about her case often and said that Lynn died from an overdose of medication. So Jessy did not confess to murder to Magdalena, but she did admit she had power of attorney over Lynn and that she took care of Lynn's finances. According to Magdalena, Jessy said she lost a lot of Lynn's money playing high-limit Texas Hold'em. Magdalena also had a few other small pieces to the case, like how Jessy was upset when the FBI did the handwriting analysis because it was done in a way that was harder for Jessy to fake her handwriting. And Jessy had also talked about how she could make Magdalena a fake ID and fake banking history when she got out of prison, and bragged that she was good at forging documents. But Jessy told Magdalena that if she got herself out on bail, she would actually go to another country to get those fake documents. When I finished watching Magdalena's testimony, I didn't really feel like it added too much to the state's case. We already know Jessy can forge documents because she went to prison for it before. And the FBI handwriting testimony wasn't a huge slam dunk, so it really doesn't seem like it needed this much effort to discredit it. But I'm not a lawyer. Maybe there was something more compelling in her testimony that just went over my head. So like I said, the defense to the financial crimes was that Lynn let Jessy spend that money, whether in a large check that she handed to her or if it was Jessy using Lynn's card while she was on vacation with her boyfriend or out at a bar that Lynn had never been to or even at the casino. It was all done with Lynn's go-ahead. So let's move on to the defense to the more serious charge. It's simple enough. 1, Lynn took her own life, and 2, the real cause of death was polysubstance overdose. Even though none of the individual medications was over the lethal limit, the interaction of them combined, plus Lynn's poor health, was what caused her death. To prove Lynn was suicidal, they called to the stand a friend of Jessy's mother, Jenny, a guy named Gary, and he had met Lynn through Jenny. Gary testified about a time that he was with Jenny and they were talking to Lynn on speakerphone. He said that Lynn was rambling, she sounded pretty tired, and she was talking about her will. She then started talking about wanting to kill herself with some detail. He also testified that he had been to Lynn's condo about a year before her death and saw that she had some things within easy reach. One was a white cup with a straw. There was a bottle of vodka. There were bottles of Visine, an ashtray, and her cigarettes. So he is placing the vodka, the cup, and the Visine all near each other. The defense also had a forensic pathologist look over Lynn's extensive medical history, which included details about Lynn dealing with depression, anxiety, and agoraphobia. And then we have her poor health, her chronic pain, and an inability/unwillingness on Lynn's part to follow doctor's orders. The pathologist said that all of those things could have contributed to making Lynn suicidal. In her opinion, she would have ruled Lynn's death as being caused by mixed drug toxicity, being the main cause of death, with Lynn's heart condition having contributed. As for the manner of death, if this case was on her desk, she would have ruled it undetermined, not homicide. So her testimony wasn't that it wasn't homicide. She testified it wasn't clearly homicide, and that's the wiggle room that the defense needed to convince the jury of reasonable doubt. The defense had another expert they wanted to bring in who actually was working on a similar case. Henry Spiller was a key witness in the defense case for James Craig in Colorado. He has been charged with poisoning his wife Angela with Visine and cyanide. Some of the work that Henry Spiller did on that case was relevant to Jessy's case, but the judge here only allowed this in a limited manner. For one thing, the report wasn't complete, and for another, it hadn't been tested in court because James Craig's trial wasn't scheduled to go forward until April of 2024, after this case wrapped up. So Spiller did testify in Jessy's defense, but it was a much more watered-down version of what the defense had hoped to get in. With the Craig case, by the way, it still hasn't happened. Unfortunately, Henry Spiller had a stroke in February, and the case has been postponed until he can recover enough to testify. They were going to have it in August, which is this month as I'm recording this, but now it's been pushed off to December. We'll see what happens. But back to Jessy Kurchewski. I want to take a second with Spiller's testimony because it was some of the most interesting medical testimony in the trial. Spiller has done research on tetrahydrozoline poisoning, specifically in the context of it being a date rape drug. But he also worked for the Poison Control Center, so many of the other medications on Lynn's tox screen were not foreign to him. He was familiar with them, particularly from a poisoning standpoint. He testified that the other drugs in Lynn's system were more likely to be contributors to Lynn's death or cause of her death than the tetrahydrozoline. One of these was a muscle relaxant. It was a medication that her doctor had actually taken her off of a while ago, so it shouldn't have been in her system at all. He claimed her levels were not, as the ME stated, therapeutic, but actually significantly above the therapeutic level. And that was just one of the drugs he said threw up a red flag for him. When asked about the tetrahydrozoline specifically, he said it would have been one of the least concerning drugs on the list. He testified that Lynn would have had to have taken between 33 and 42 pills to have the levels of the other drugs get to where they were in her system. That's a lot of pills to have taken. Spiller also testified that he didn't believe Lynn ingested 6 bottles of eye drops. He said about a teaspoon was left in her stomach, and she would have had to take more to get her blood level up, but not 6 bottles worth. I will say a teaspoon is about 5 milliliters, which is about a third of a bottle of Visine, and that still seems like quite a bit to have ingested. We're not talking a couple drops. We're talking in the 75 to 100 drop range, and really any ingestion would be a reason to pause. But here's the thing with him testifying that it wasn't 6 bottles. That number did not come from the state. The ME did not calculate it. The police did not find 6 empty Visine bottles. The entire story that Lynn drank 6 bottles of eye drops came from Jessy. That's how many Jessy said Lynn had in her bottle of water. So the defense expert was contradicting the defendant's own words. As for the state, in cross-examining this witness, they did what lawyers do with experts. They questioned their credibility and their expertise. They pointed out that the school that Henry Spiller got his degree from has been shut down by the state of California. They also noted that his expertise was in poison control toxicology, and that all of his research was with living people. He wasn't a medical examiner. He had also testified at a prior hearing that Lynn had taken as few as 21 pills, but then changed it to more in his trial testimony, which brings into question his calculations. The state asked Spiller about his opinion on tetrahydrozoline being used to make someone vulnerable, and he said, yes, it does. When people are drugged with THZ in a situation like a date rape scenario, he said that they do come to and remember those times before often falling back to sleep. They would be too drowsy for someone to, say, force pills down their throat, but this does go to something the state was insinuating a bit and would later be stated outright, and that was a suspicion that Jessy had been dosing Lynn all along so that she could steal without Lynn noticing. The defense rested without Jessy taking the stand, and her mother Jenny also didn't take the stand, even though Jessy wanted her to and Jenny wanted to testify. I tried to find the exact point where she was barred from testifying, but the trial footage in this case is over 100 hours long, and I just couldn't find it. I'm under the impression that the reason she couldn't testify is because she and Jessy were discussing what happened in court after a day's proceedings, and Jenny, as a witness, was not allowed to know what other people testified to before she was called to the stand. That is what I read somewhere was the reason she couldn't testify, but if I am incorrect, I will make a correction on my next episode if anyone emails me to let me know why she didn't testify, even though Jessy said she wanted her to. Anyway, both sides then gave their closing arguments, which I thought were pretty good. They did a lot to wrap up what they had presented at trial. But the state definitely had more to work with, to be honest. The defense, they did what they could with what they had. They showed those month-by-month banking records to show that Lynn wasn't exactly someone who didn't spend any money, like some of the people who testified about how thrifty she was kind of implied. They showed that the police didn't really process the scene as they believed it was an overdose, and even their memories 5 years later couldn't be relied on because they all testified that they did not see any eye drops at the scene, but there was a bottle in plain sight near where Lynn had been found. This bottle did not have tetrahydrozoline in it, but it did illustrate that the testimony of what people saw and what they heard 5 years later can not always be relied on. The defense also pointed out some of Lynn's prescriptions that had no pills left in them. So I looked pretty closely on this list, and there were really only 2 on there that were 1, recently filled, and 2, clearly had fewer pills in them than they should have. Lynn had a September 20th prescription for Xanax. It said to take 1 per night before bed. And then she had a September 28th prescription for Vicodin saying to take 1 every 6 hours as needed. Both were 30 pills and both were empty. With the Xanax, Lynn should have had 17 pills left because she was only supposed to take 1 at bedtime. With the Vicodin, she should have had at least 6 pills left if she took them every 6 hours without fail. Those bottles should not have been at 0, and that is definitely an indication that Lynn was at the very least not taking her medication responsibly, and possibly, as the defense is trying to say, worse, that she took it to purposely overdose herself. The defense argued that the state did not prove homicide beyond a reasonable doubt. They didn't prove that Lynn didn't consent to giving Jessy the money when she was alive. And as for the money taken from the estate, they argued that the estate wasn't even closed yet. So I think the argument there is that the charge was simply premature. The state had a great line in their closing that I want to refer to because I think it sums up their case. Quote, "To believe this was a suicide, you would have to believe that by the most cosmic intervention in the entire world, it happened at the exact point in time when Miss Kurchewski maximized the amount of money that she made on this whole ordeal." End quote. Basically, Lynn died right as Jessy got everything out of her she could alive, and then she killed her to get the rest. The jury took the case, and it was a tricky one because they had to decide between 3 different crimes: murder, theft before Lynn's death, and theft after. All 3 had to be deliberated over. And my speculation is that the theft after death was the easiest to get to since she clearly stole from the estate. She forged documents to trick the other heir out of most of his share. And I don't think the estate needs to be closed to prove that. But regardless of how easy any one of the charges were, the jury still spent 10.5 hours deliberating over 2 days on all 3 charges before returning with a verdict on November 14th, 2023. Jessy Kurchewski sobbed as she was found guilty on all counts. And this is where I usually say she was sentenced to X number of years and vowed to appeal, and I'll keep you updated, but believe it or not, this case is not over. Sentencing was initially scheduled for December 7th, 2023, but here's what happened. Prior to sentencing, a woman came forward to the sheriff's department. She is someone who knew Jessy because they had been locked up together on pretrial detention, and this woman felt bad for Jessy. She attended most of the trial to support her. Well, after the trial, a letter appeared at her house on November 26th in a large envelope. It was addressed to her, and there were stamps in the corner, but there was no postmark on it, so it doesn't look like it went through the postal service. Inside the envelope were 37 handwritten pages that purported to be from Jessy. After the friend read them, she called her attorney to ask what to do, and her attorney said to turn it all over to the police, which she did, and then the sheriff called the district attorney. I could really make this a 3-parter by reading you the 37 pages in their entirety, but let's just hit the highlights. I will link to the whole thing on my website, basementfortproductions.com, if you want to look at it. The link will be in the show notes. But before I start getting into the contents of this packet, let me state at the top that even though the letter is signed Jessy, she denies she wrote it. So when I say Jessy wrote, know that I'm meaning the person claiming to be Jessy, whether it's Jessy claiming to be Jessy or someone else claiming to be Jessy. I mean the letter writer. We'll get into an analysis on whether or not she wrote this letter at the end, but we need to know what it says before we can evaluate it. The first portion of the letter is what I'm going to call a cover letter. Before getting to the why she's writing the letter, Jessy is really insisting on her innocence. She wrote that the hardest part about the whole thing was that she would not be able to see her grandparents before they died, and she would not be able to have children, which is interestingly something I think about frequently when I hear about people going to prison in their 20s or 30s and they're not going to get out until their 50s or later. I mean, I'm sure not all of the people who go to prison are going to make great parents, but some of them would. And I think I'm putting a lot of my own identity as a parent into feeling bad for people who lose that opportunity, even when it's through their own choices, but even worse if it's through circumstance or a wrongful conviction. But anyway, Jessy said that she found discovery after the trial that proved that, quote, they lied on the stand. She doesn't specify who. Then Jessy goes on to write that she talked with one of her attorneys in person and she had a big ask for this friend. It was such a big ask that Jessy said that whether the friend helped her out or not, she had to take the information to her grave. Jessy wrote that the envelope was not going to go through the jail mail, but rather her attorney was going to get it out of the jail for her. And in fact, it was one of her attorney's ideas to do all of this. So, what was all of this? What was the big ask? If you remember towards the end of part 1, I said that Jessy claimed she buried evidence at Whitnall Park, which was near where she lived in Franklin, Wisconsin. Jessy, or the person pretending to be her, wrote that that was 100% true. She buried old Visine bottles, parts from the gun, some of Lynn's papers, and the tape recording of Lynn recording her last will and testament and suicide note. But the problem was, those items were not in the park anymore. According to the letter writer, she walked in the park regularly, and where she buried the bag of stuff was an area that was prone to flooding. One day, she walked by and saw the plastic bag sticking up out of the ground. So she dug it up and just threw it away because she didn't think she would ever need the items in there, and she didn't want people to know what was written in these handwritten documents and what Lynn said on this recording. She said her attorney knew that it wasn't there anymore and that everyone else either thought it was still in the park or they had never believed her story to begin with. What Jessy was asking her friend to do was help recreate this evidence and pretend she just so happened to find it in the park. So the bulk of the 37 pages in this packet were writings to make it look like they came from Lynn Hernan. The instructions were to take these documents that were quote-unquote from Lynn and photocopy them a bunch of times to fade them and age them. Then the friend needed to go get a notary stamp online. Not buy the actual stamp, but if you go online to buy a notary stamp, they show you a proof of what it would look like with your name, your number, your state, your county, the expiration date, all of those details. So what Jessy was instructing the friend to do was go on one of those websites, get that sample stamp image, and drop it into these documents. She then needed to photocopy those a bunch of times. The photocopying is going to distort it enough to make it more difficult to spot as a phony. Jessy gave her friend the names of 2 notaries to use, and these names were people who notarized things for Lynn in the past. So a notary's job is just to look at your ID, watch you sign the document with your name, and then verify with their stamp and signature that you are the person who signed it. It is not their job to verify the veracity of the documents or to testify that they are truthful documents. Their job is to match signature to ID to person. So the people at the bank who were notarizing Lynn's documents wouldn't have been reading them with any depth and wouldn't know what was in them. And it was so many years ago that even if they glanced at some of it, they probably likely wouldn't remember specific instances of notarizing things. So let's talk about what these documents were that were supposedly recreations of real documents supposedly buried in the park. One was a written confession from Lynn. And what did Lynn need to confess to? Well, according to this document, she needed to confess to killing her mother, Lorraine. Supposedly, Lynn wrote that after she got out of prison and reconciled with her mother, she started stealing from her. Her mother found out and threatened to cut her out of the will, and she was going to instead leave everything to her best friend, who is named in this confession, and it is the same person who is listed in Lorraine's obituary as her best friend. That fact checks out, but the will part does not. Unless the Wisconsin probate court is lying to me, Lorraine died without a will that she could have cut her daughter out of. The fake note had Lynn confessing that she saw something on TV about putting Visine in someone's drink, and so she started putting it in her mom's tea. And that is what killed Lorraine. In the part of this packet with the letter that supposedly Jessy wrote, it did go into more detail saying that Lorraine got dizzy from the Visine and fell down the stairs, not that she died directly from poisoning. Anyway, fake Lynn wrote out this confession and said that it was part of why she couldn't live anymore. She couldn't live with what she had done to her mother. And it's also what got her to start drinking eye drops. She first tried it to take her own life, but then she liked how it numbed her and it gave her a sleepy feeling. So she kept using it sort of medicinally for her back pain and insomnia. So in addition to the confession and what amounts to a suicide note, Lynn also supposedly left a new will in this stack of papers. The new will was written in February of 2018. In it, fake Lynn left everything to Jessy's mother, Jenny, instead of Jessy and Anthony. But it's clear she intended the money to benefit Jessy, because she wrote the only reason she wasn't leaving it to Jessy was because she didn't want the probation agent to take it to pay restitution for her previous fraud case. She knew that Jenny would take care of Jessy. She wrote that Anthony didn't really need the money. Justification on why you're not leaving money to specific non-relatives isn't something you usually see in a will. And something that's also interesting about this will is it's not the first new will disinheriting Anthony that would come up. I tried to avoid getting too deep in the weeds on the probate stuff because it's not all relevant to the criminal case, but we do have to back up and cover a little bit of it because of this new will. When Anthony realized that things didn't seem to be adding up with Lynn's estate and he knew Jessy was being looked at by the investigators, he hired an attorney to go over everything. And when she first looked at it, she initially didn't see anything wrong. It looked like this woman died with a lot of debt and the personal representative, who is Jessy, was doing what she needed to pay things off. But then she looked a little closer and noticed some red flags, like how Lynn owed credit card debt almost equal to the equity she had in her condo, and how the receipts Jessy sent to Anthony weren't lining up with what she put into the accounting. So Anthony's attorney argued to the judge that Jessy shouldn't be the personal representative anymore after she was locked up on a parole violation, and the judge agreed. In October of 2019, Anthony was appointed as the personal representative for the estate rather than Jessy, and about a week and a half after that motion was granted, Jessy filed a newer will, supposedly from Lynn, that cut Anthony out completely. Unlike Lynn's original will that was typed and witnessed by strangers, this new one was handwritten and it was witnessed by Jessy and her mother, Jenny. It is not against the law to have a handwritten will, but it is a red flag that Lynn didn't just go back and have it drawn up the same way she had the original one drawn up. But the real issue with this will, though, is that Jenny and Jessy were the only heirs named in the new will, so they really shouldn't also have been the only witnesses. With this new will, Jessy also filed a letter Lynn supposedly wrote that explained why Jessy waited to file the more recent will, even though she had it the whole time. Lynn wrote that she had a test of sorts for Anthony. Jessy had been instructed to file the first will and see what Anthony did. If he caused any problems or made a stink in regards to the will or the estate, Lynn wanted him disinherited and the second will be filed instead. That doesn't make any sense, so the original will stood. So when I say that there was a will in this 37-page packet, it was supposedly will number 3 that we're talking about. One was typed and witnessed by strangers. One was handwritten and witnessed by the two beneficiaries. And now we have a handwritten replica of a will that someone threw out, and now they need to get a fake notary stamp on the new one. So getting these replica letters and will notarized was the first ask in the letter. The second one was something else Jessy had claimed to the police was in the park. It wasn't the Visine bottles or the piece of a ghost gun. There's just no way to replicate those items in a way the police wouldn't be able to track. But there was a tape-recorded statement Lynn left behind, supposedly, my favorite word of this episode, and that needed to be recreated because if they had Lynn's own voice, they couldn't accuse Jessy of forging these documents. Jessy wrote that she could not have her mom do it because she'd be the one the police suspected, so she needed someone else. She went on to describe Lynn's voice as an older female voice that was raspy and had a smoker's cough. The recording would have been from 2 days before Lynn's death, so she should have also sounded sick. And once you account for her sounding sick, which would make her sound off, plus the fact that no one had Lynn's voice recorded, and she had been dead for 5 years, who could really say for sure if it was her or not, if it was close enough? She asked the friend to find someone she trusted to make this recording, or maybe use a voice changer online. She could make the recording with a movie or music in the background, which would help distract even more and make it harder for people to know if this really was Lynn. She even included a little tip to make sure that whatever was playing in the background was something that was already out at the time of Lynn's death. Then she wrote out the script that the friend was supposed to be using, which was very similar to what was in the notes. She was tired of being so sick, and she was going to take the Visine. If this wasn't enough, there were also instructions to wear gloves, examples of what a notary stamp should look like and how to make sure it was a little off-center and not perfectly straight so it looked more authentic. And then there was a sample cover letter that the friend was supposed to write out and send when she mailed all of these things to the judge. Basically, in the cover letter, the friend was not supposed to say who she was, just that she was a concerned citizen and she had been watching the trial start to finish and believed Jessy was innocent. In fact, the line she should use was, "Anybody who has a brain cell can tell you this girl didn't do it." The sample letter included a story about spending 3 days in the park looking for the evidence, eventually finding it, and that they threw away the Visine bottles and the gun parts because they really had no bearing, and then send the cassette and the papers to the judge. Jessy ended the packet by saying to burn everything when the friend was done. Don't talk about it on the phone or in the jail during a visit because that's all recorded. And it needed to get to the judge before sentencing. And then she requested the friend make copies of all the documents and send them to her attorneys, the prosecution, and a bunch of media outlets. But the friend instead, as we know, gave it all to the police. Like I said, Jessy said she was not behind this packet and she did not send it to her friend. Someone else did for some unknown reason. So it's really hard to prove a negative, to prove you didn't do anything other than saying you didn't do it. So let's look at the evidence that she did do it. At a hearing, Jessy said that they should pull the security footage from the prison and it would show that she never had this packet in her possession. So the state did what she suggested. They pulled the footage. And they found a video recording from shortly before this letter would have been sent to her friend that showed Jessy holding a similar envelope. I'm going to link to the video on my website as well, so you can get to it by clicking the link in the show notes. It'll bring you to the timeline, the pictures, and the documents. The video shows Jessy sitting on her bunk, putting papers into an envelope, and then trying to seal up that envelope. She got up, she walked out of the pod area briefly, holding it, and then came back and put it on the cot of another woman named Amy. A few minutes later, Amy came into the room, picked up the envelope, and walked away. Going to another camera, they saw her hand the envelope to a corrections officer. He then put it in a bin where he usually put things that he would later take to the mailroom. Now, the 2 stamps in the corner were the same 2 stamps as on the envelope that Jessy's friend got. But it's still hard to say because if this CO took it down to the mailroom, why did it not go through the postal machine and cancel out the stamps? There was no postmark on it. If we look at the contents of the letter written and the documents from Lynn, it seems like there was a lot of information in there. A casual viewer of the trial would not have known all of this, so it would have been a very detailed viewer. There were some things in there that I don't know came up at trial, like the cover letter. It refers to things in the personal life of the friend, like her kids and giving condolences for the friend's recent loss of her brother. This friend did not testify at the trial, so how would this have been something they would have known about? But the biggest hurdle to get over, if we're going to say Jessy didn't write this, was the paper it was written on. On the back of some of the pages were trial notes that appeared to be in the same handwriting as the person who wrote the cover letter. That doesn't immediately mean Jessy. It was just someone who wanted to reuse some paper they had, very eco-conscious of them. But the problem was that the trial notes were not just one person's handwriting. These were clearly little notes back and forth clarifying things, and Jessy's attorneys, or at least one of them, recognized her own handwriting. So the person who sent this packet didn't just reuse their trial notes. They reused Jessy's trial notes. The only person who could have had those notes other than Jessy, in my view, would be her mother or her attorneys, and I don't think either one of them did this. So when Jessy's sentencing hearing was held on December 7th, instead of the judge sentencing her, her attorneys asked to be removed from the case. This is a pretty big deal, and especially after trial but before sentencing. The judge was extremely reluctant to move forward with this request because it would mean another attorney coming in, having to catch up on everything, which would then delay sentencing, and it would delay Jessy's appeal because she couldn't appeal until after everything was done. The judge, Judge Jennifer Darrow, who also presided in the rather infamous Darrell Brooks case, wanted to be convinced why the attorneys could not stay on. One of Jessy's attorneys would only say that he called the state bar and they advised him that there was a conflict and he should withdraw from the case. He did not seem willing to say anything beyond that. The other attorney, however, argued that the cover letter said that the ruse was the idea of one of Jessy's attorneys and that they smuggled the letter out for her. Jessy only had 2 attorneys, and it went against their interests to continue to represent her with an accusation on the table. The state argued against any delays, so they did not want Jessy's team to be able to withdraw. They said that they did not believe either attorney was involved in this, and while there was an ongoing investigation into how the letter came to be, the attorneys were not being investigated. The state only wanted this 37-page packet admitted for the sake of sentencing as it spoke to Jessy's character and nothing beyond that. Plus, the defense could not argue this was a conflict according to the state, because Jessy said she didn't write the letter. It would be different if she stood behind it and said, yes, I wrote it, yes, I accused my attorneys of these things. But if she didn't write it, then her attorneys didn't tell her to write it, and there is no conflict. Jessy kept trying to talk in court, but the judge made her wait until she heard from the attorneys on both sides, and then she asked Jessy if she wanted her attorneys to continue to represent her. And Jessy said she did at first, but not any longer. She said as soon as the DA told them about the packet, her lawyer stopped preparing for sentencing, and she was pretty upset about that. She blamed the state, saying that they released the information about the packet, so therefore they were the ones who created the mess. But I don't think the DA really had an option not to disclose this to the defense, since 1, they wanted to use it in sentencing, and 2, there was an accusation against at least one of the attorneys in the letter. Judge Darrow said that even if they kept the defense team on, she would still delay sentencing because she recognized there was an issue with the preparation. Jessy was then asked if she would still be okay with them staying on if sentencing was delayed, and Jessy still said no. And with that, the judge very reluctantly granted her attorney's request to withdraw. Jessy was given 2 new attorneys who then withdrew a month later due to a conflict of interest, and then Jessy got another new attorney. This delayed sentencing until early April 2024. Jessy made a nearly 2-hour-long statement at sentencing, which I watched start to finish. Thank you, YouTube, for 1.5 speed. Let's go ahead and just hit the highlights of my notes. Jessy started this thing by reading in full letters Lynn supposedly wrote. These were the ones she claimed she found in Lynn's home after her death, and they came up very limited at the trial, so this is the first time we heard them in full. The first letter Jessy read was addressed to Jessy, and it was written on September 16th. Lynn allegedly wrote about being an addict and stealing from people, but being so disappointed in Jessy when she got arrested because she actually stole from family members rather than strangers. She wrote about how she got driven out of Madison after her burglary arrest and then went on and on about her drug use and crimes she committed and crimes she thought about committing. And, of course, within this, Lynn also confessed to killing her mother with Visine, just like in the supposed confession in the packet. She wrote that her mother was sick and she gave it to her to move her along, but Lynn realized her own illness was payback for what she did to her mother. One night after a night of partying, she confessed to her drug dealer what she did, and then he proceeded to blackmail her. In this letter to Jessy that Jessy was now reading to the court, Lynn wrote, quote, "You know all those checks I wrote you? This was why, end quote. So Lynn, in her letter to Jessy, exonerated Jessy from the theft because Lynn was writing checks to Jessy because she had to pay a blackmailer, but somehow Jessy didn't know that. I don't know how this makes sense. The letter goes on to say that the blackmail stopped after the drug dealer died, and at that point, Lynn decided to get a bunch of credit cards and just live it up before the end of her own life. Then she wrote that she made a new will since Anthony didn't need the money, and she also wanted other friends barred from her condo after her death. Lynn then wrote that she cheated and lied her whole life and didn't regret it, but she was happy Jessy wasn't going down that path any longer. And I think that's kind of a weird thing for Lynn to have written because the defense already argued that Lynn applied for a loan with Jessy using fake documents, so Lynn would have known at this point that Jessy was still committing these crimes, so why would she say she was glad Jessy wasn't doing that anymore when she knew she was? Quite a contradiction in the narrative. But moving on, Lynn also wrote about how Jessy and her boyfriend Scott were lovey-dovey and she hoped Jessy had kids of her own one day because she was so good to Scott's kids. And I will point out that it is at this point, as she's reading the letter, that Jessy does start to cry. My question, though, is how did Lynn know any of this? Scott previously testified that he never met Lynn. He offered to go with Jessy to visit her, but Jessy told him that Lynn was a sick, alcoholic recluse who didn't like people to visit. So how did Lynn know they were lovey-dovey if she never saw them together? The letter was basically Lynn saying that she herself was a terrible, awful person, and Jessy was a wonderful angel. Now, the next letter Jessy read was supposedly written on October 1st, and it talked about Lynn leaving behind the cassette tape with her wishes. Lynn wrote that she had been stocking up on the Visine and would start drinking it soon to end her life. Lynn then just started going on about the other people in her life, tearing them down, and the letter ended with "F you all," directed at those people, because according to this letter, all they cared about was the money. Jessy finished reading the letters and then started reading her own prepared statement. She did start by talking about how Lynn loved live music and loved animals and black and white movies, and she did say some nice things about her. But then Jessy took a sharp left turn. She starts arguing that Lynn took her own life, and she backed up to that story about Lynn's dad dying while Lynn was in jail for the OWI. But unless I don't know how to read, or the Wisconsin court records are just messed up, Lynn wasn't locked up when her father died. She pleaded guilty days before his death, but she was allowed to be free on bond until sentencing, which happened after his death. Now, this strikes me as a detail that maybe a friend like Jenny or even Lynn's other friend Corrine remembered incorrectly 10 years later. And so they had told the story about, oh, Lynn really had a rough time because her dad died while she was locked up. Not to give Jessy fodder for running Lynn's name through the mud, but just in the course of conversation, and they mentioned it, and they just had that detail wrong. Now, why am I harping on this one detail? I don't really know. You're going to have to ask Jessy why she kept bringing it up. It was seen as this point in Lynn's life that really impacted her, turned everything on its head, because he died while she was locked up and she couldn't even go to the funeral, but from everything I can find, that's just not true. So then Jessy goes on in her statement talking about how much money Lynn inherited from her mother. And this is another thing that you can look up. It is public record. And I swear the Wisconsin Circuit Court access site is going to IP ban me after the number of cases I had to look up for these 2 episodes. It lists that the general inventory of the estate, which is an accounting of the assets, is about $183,000. So how did Lynn end up with almost $350,000 in that money market account? We don't know, but the implication here is that Lynn had stolen the rest. And what Lynn was doing in the 5, 6, 7 years prior to her death mattered, because according to Jessy, it all compounded and led her to suicide. Jessy said her intention was not to talk bad about Lynn, but that's most of what she did in her statement. Jessy said it could be proven through phone records that none of the people who claimed to be Lynn's friend were in contact with her in the 6 months or a year before her death, but that her attorneys didn't look into it. It would have undermined their credibility as witnesses, and she thought it should have been pursued. Jessy was also upset that the police wouldn't take her to the park to find the bag of evidence she buried. She's basically in this statement telling us what to expect to see on her appeal. As for Jessy happening to be drugged with Visine after Lynn's death, but before the police told her that's what killed her, Jessy said she had actually found the suicide notes outlining all of it a month before, and she wondered how Visine would make her feel, so she took some, and it made her feel tired and sick. She said she lied to Scott about how she came to ingest Visine because she was supposed to take his son to a birthday party and she couldn't bring him, so she basically needed an excuse to make it not her fault. Jessy was not the only one who spoke at her sentencing. There was an older woman who was in lockup with her before trial, and she found Jessy to be kind and caring, very generous to other inmates who didn't have money on their books, and basically spoke to another side of Jessy's character, which is what usually happens when people speak for the defendant. It's not exactly what happened when Jessy's mother, Jenny, spoke. She also read a letter supposedly from Lynn. It was more of Lynn calling herself a liar and a cheat and a killer and going on about how amazing Jessy was. Jenny also read a letter that disinherited Anthony and just kept praising Jessy. The letter claimed Lynn hadn't even seen Anthony in a year, even though Anthony testified that he saw Lynn a month before she supposedly wrote this letter. Now, the letter continues to drag all of Lynn's other friends, all except Jenny and Jessy, and calling them phony. Jenny said she was disappointed that Jessy's past and gambling addiction came in at trial, but a lot of Lynn's past was excluded, like her OWIs and then some accusation that Lynn got fired for theft. After that, Jenny criticized others' courtroom behavior, saying they knew who they were, and then she ended her statement after 20 minutes. Judge Darrow then asked Jenny if there was anything else she would like to say, perhaps about her daughter's character, as she had mostly just made statements against other people like Lynn and Anthony and Lynn's other friends. Jenny just said she believed Jessy was innocent and Lynn took her own life. Judge Darrow then took her turn to speak in a rather lengthy statement and gave her own assessment of the case. She said she had to ask herself a rhetorical question. Was Jessy poisoning Lynn all along? Was it a coincidence? The sicker Lynn got, the more money Jessy spent. If Jessy had been slowly poisoning Lynn, Judge Darrow said she must have been bolstered by Lynn's September hospitalization, where the doctors did not detect any eye drop ingestion. With home health care coming later in that week, this was the window Jessy had to act before more eyes were on her. Judge Darrow said she did not believe Lynn wrote all those letters herself, or at least not willingly. And as for the buried evidence in the park, Jessy had from November after Lynn's death through early July before she got arrested to go to that park and get it herself, and she never did. In short, the case was summed up like this. The paper trail of fake invoices, letters, and documented mismanagement of estate funds proved the theft. And if Lynn was as suicidal as Jessy claimed, why didn't Jessy get her any help? Why didn't she warn Lynn's doctors or reach out to more people? She didn't do that because Lynn was not suicidal. There were holes in Jessy's story, and the judge saw every single one of them. She sentenced Jessy to life in prison with parole eligibility after 30 years, plus another 10 years for the theft counts. Even given credit for time served, Jessy will be nearly 80 before she can apply for parole. She was also ordered to pay a restitution of $386,000. About $341,000 of that was direct repayment for the money she stole. That gives you an idea of the scope of what she took from 2016 until her arrest in 2019. Jessy was also ordered to tell her attorney where Lynn's ashes were, so a court order could be served to reclaim them. They turned out they were with her mom, Jenny, and the court eventually ordered them to be given to Anthony, which I believe has happened. Jessy does plan to mount an appeal, of course, and I will keep you updated on whatever new twists and turns this case takes. But because so much of Jessy's case involved her and her mother tearing Lynn down, I want to leave us instead with the victim impact statements. So first, here's what her ex-boyfriend and longtime friend Jim had to say about Lynn.
Your Honor, Lynn was a kind, caring, giving person. She had a heart of gold. She would help anyone at any time. Lynn was a real sweetheart. She had the looks. She was a very beautiful lady. She had the grace and style. She was a real class act. She loved the outdoors, the sunshine, the beaches, going out on the lakes, the wave runners, or on the pontoon boat. She was also a great cook, and anyone that knew her loved her cooking and her baking. She was also an awesome beautician. Lynn was a lady that always had to look her best, and she always wanted her customers to look their best also. Lynn was also an animal lover. She had a few cats and dogs over the years. Lynn did nothing wrong. She inherited money from her parents so that she had money to live out the rest of her life. But Jessy had other plans.
And here is what Anthony said to Jessy on behalf of himself and his family, who were also Lynn's friends. I think his words are as gracious as someone in this situation could ever be, and I'll let those close us out.
Dear Jessy, we write this letter with the hope you are in a state of reflection and introspection. We write to you under circumstances neither of us could have imagined, circumstances that have altered the course of all of our lives in profound and irreversible ways. We want to start by expressing the depth of the pain and loss we have experienced since the tragic events that unfolded. The void left by the absence of Auntie Linny, our close friend, is immense and unfathomable. Her laughter, her kindness, her presence, these are now memories we cling to amidst the darkness of grief. The pain of Lynn's absence is not solely ours to bear. It echoes through the lives of her friends and all those who were touched by her warmth and generosity throughout her life, whether it be during the holidays or on a random afternoon or evening for an appetizer and drink. We are not writing out of vengeance, but rather out of the need for understanding, closure, and perhaps even healing. I implore you to acknowledge the gravity of your actions and the irreparable harm that you have inflicted upon so many lives. Incarceration offers an opportunity for reflection, redemption, and rehabilitation. I urge you to use this opportunity to confront the demons that led you down this dark path and to emerge from this ordeal as a better, more compassionate human being. We also want to take this opportunity to share with you the humanity of Auntie Linny. She was more than just a statistic, more than just a name in a news headline. She was a beloved friend, a cherished family member, a bright light extinguished far too soon. These are the most important things to be remembered about somebody who is deeply loved by many and taken out due to selfish greed. As you serve your sentence, I hope you reflect on the impact of your actions and find the strength to atone for them and stop your life of deceit and lies. I hope you know your charade is up and that you will never fool anyone again. In closing, we want to express sincere hope for healing for myself, my mom, my dad, Keith and Diana, Jim, and for all of Lynn's loved ones, and even for you, as I do know Lynn never knew it would be someone who became so close to her that would slay her. May we all find the courage to confront our pain, the wisdom to seek forgiveness, and the compassion to embrace the possibility of redemption. With hope for a better tomorrow, the Poses and family.
It is time for August Patreon birthday shout-outs. I appreciate you hanging in there with a long episode to hear these. I think one of the things learning about other people and their lives really gives us is the reminder that every year we have is precious and every birthday we have is deserving of being celebrated because of that. So I want to send a very happy birthday to my Patreon supporters, Stacy, Vertrice, Nicola, Kelsey, Ella, Megan I, Christina, Lee, Alex, Kimberly, Marietta, and Megan B. I hope this month has been amazing for you in celebrating your birthdays, and I hope that this next year brings you even more joy than the year before. And to you, I want to wish you a happy birthday.
Picture this. You're not just fixing cars, you're living your passion every day. At Cox, you'll work on a diverse range of automobiles. Surrounded by a team of friendly, like-minded individuals, you'll enjoy great pay and benefits. Ready to make this a reality? At Cox, we're recruiting auto and diesel techs to join our Mannheim and Fleet Services teams. Learn, grow, and fine-tune your career as a technician at Cox. Find out more at cox.career/autotech.